Good evening, this is David Kramer with Alaska Weather on this New Year's Eve for 2020. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, get updates to the forecast, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, get updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen at david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at some of the records that we have broken recently. Now, these for the North Pacific pressure record, these are estimated values done by the Ocean Prediction Center, as we do not have observations out over much of the open water. So in 2015, on December 13th, we had an old record of 924 millibars. Again, that is estimated by the Ocean Prediction Center. However, today, in December 31st, 2020, we have a new record, 921 millibar low, as that's approaching the western Aleutian Islands. And then we also broke the record for land-based observations, where we actually have data centers that can collect this information. So in 1977, on October 25th, at Dutch Harbor, we had a measured low of 927 millibars. And then today we had at Shemya Air Station 926.5 millibars measured, beating that old record by half a millibar with that incredibly low pressure at 926.5. Taking a look now at some of the warnings and advisories that we have out for the state. We'll start off in southeast Alaska for the Misty Fjords area. We do have a winter weather advisory out for snow for the Misty Fjords area. That's expecting to see snow amounts from 7 to 10 inches. That's going to start this evening at 9 p.m. and go until 9 p.m. on Friday. As we move up to our northern locations, especially along the west coast here, we have our blizzard warning remaining in effect along the western Arctic coastline, specifically from Point Ley and areas farther to the west. That is going to continue to be in effect until 6 p.m. on Friday. Winds are going to gust up to as high as 45 miles per hour, bringing the potential for whiteout conditions in those areas from Point Ley to the west. And we are going to also see some wind chills down to as low as 50 below. Down in St. Lawrence Island, we have another blizzard warning that will take effect at 6 a.m. on Friday and go until midnight on Friday. We're also going to see winds gusting up to as high as 45 miles per hour in the area and potential for whiteout conditions there as well. And then finally, down in the Yukon Delta area, we have a winter weather advisory out for blowing snow conditions. This is going to start at 6 a.m. on Friday and go until 6 p.m. on Friday, with winds gusting up to as high as 40 miles per hour and those blowing snow conditions dropping down visibilities to a half mile or less at times. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we can see our very deep low by the western Aleutians slowly tracking right over that Shemya area. And as we watch this again, we can watch the front associated with this system pushing into the western and central portions of the Bering Sea, moving across the central Aleutians as well. We have another low out south of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing in some cloud cover out over much of the Gulf, as well as into the Panhandle area. Not quite bringing the precipitation to the area yet, but we can see that cloud cover out in advance of that front. Finally, over mainland Alaska, we don't have very much cloud cover, as much of the area is under the effects of high pressure, keeping most of mainland fairly dry. However, we do have some cloud cover from a weaker low out over northeastern Russia, out over the west coast of the state. Taking a look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we'll start with our deep low by the western Aleutians, bringing some very strong winds, hurricane force winds to many of the marine areas around the central and western Aleutians, as well as western Bering. And then we are going to see, or this is where we also had our high wind warning out for the central Aleutian Islands, some of those stronger winds. We're going to see a lot of snow associated with this system as well for the central and western Aleutians, a rain and snow mix for the eastern Aleutian Islands, and some of that snow making it to the Pribilof Islands for today. Out ahead of this system, not seeing a lot of activity, just some lighter showers by the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, and for the eastern portions of the Kenai Peninsula. We'll have some lighter snow out over the Norton Sound area, as well as the blizzard conditions with blowing snow along the northwest Arctic coastline. However, as we get to Utqiagvik and areas farther to the east, we are going to expect to see primarily fog. Then over the Panhandle area, fairly dry. However, we can see the rain coming in advance of that system south of the Gulf of Alaska. As we move into tonight, as that front approaches southeast Alaska, we'll see that precipitation spread throughout all of the areas of the Panhandle, where we will see some snow developing over the coastal ranges, as well as higher elevations in central and northern locations of the Panhandle, and areas farther to the north expecting to see primarily snow. At over mainland Alaska, still seeing primarily dry conditions for central and eastern locations. However, the west coast starting to see a lot of snow ahead of that front moving through the Bering Sea. We'll start to see some of the blowing snow developing over the Yukon Delta, St. Lawrence Island, and continue blowing snow along the northwest coast, as well as some areas of snow for Kotzebue Sound and Seward Peninsula. Up along the rest of the Arctic coast, we will see some areas of fog, and then more snow down in the Bristol Bay area, as well as a rain-snow mix for Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula. Snow primarily associated with that low out by the western Aleutians. Still going to see some stronger winds as well for tonight, as we will still have a 927 millibar low out by the western Aleutians. That snow is also going to extend out throughout all of the Bering Sea, with some areas mixed with rain by the western Aleutians. As we move into Friday, that low slowly pushing to the east. However, it is going to start to weaken now, getting to 936 millibars, but the winds will still be fairly strong throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands from that low. Going to see a mixture of rain and snow for the central and western Aleutians, and then some snow for the Pribilofs, as well as the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. That snow now with the front pushing into eastern Bering Sea, going to bring some snow to the west or the southwest coastline, as well as continued blowing snow for the Yukon Delta, St. Lawrence Island, and the western portions of the Arctic coast. As we get up along the AKwx areas and further to the east, we are expecting to see continued fog, and then fairly dry for much of the rest of mainland Alaska. However, we'll see quite a bit of precipitation around the Gulf of Alaska from that low south of the Gulf, with a mix of rain and snow for the Kodiak Island area, as well as much of the Panhandle, where we will see southern locations primarily rain, but more snow as you get further to the north in areas at higher elevations, to include all of the coastal ranges. Finally, as we move into Saturday, that low is going to push into the eastern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, continuing to bring precipitation to the Panhandle area. Again, primarily snow at coastal ranges, higher elevations, and areas farther to the north. Out over much of the Gulf, we'll see primarily rain, but as we get closer to Kodiak Island, especially at higher elevations, we'll see more snow. Mainland Alaska is still going to be fairly dry, with some areas of fog lingering along much of the Arctic coastline, with some lingering areas of blowing snow from Point Hope down through the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island areas. Our deep low now diminishing quite a bit to 954 millibars, moving closer towards the central portions of the Aleutian Islands. Still some decent winds around this low even on Saturday, but we'll see a lot of snow for the Aleutian Islands and much of the Bering Sea as we get closer towards the Pribilof Islands and into the Alaska Peninsula. For our temperatures on Friday morning, looking at those lows, we're going to drop down to the mid-30s for the southern locations of the Panhandle, into the 20s as we get farther to the north. 20s around much of the North Gulf Coast, but as we move interior locations, the South Central dropping down to the teens and eventually single digits by Talkeetna. Copper River Basin staying much colder, minus 13 for that low for Glen Allen. In the interior, we're going to see temperatures drop below zero most locations. Some of the western interior are going to hold on to some single digits. And then along the Arctic coastline, dropping down to near minus 20 most locations, warmer as we get farther to the west. West Coast is going to see temperatures in the teens, with Savunga staying warmer at 23 degrees. Down in southwest Alaska, primarily 20s, but dropping down into the teens and eventually single digits more interior locations. For the Aleutian Islands, going to drop down into the 30s at all locations, and that's going to be true for the Alaska Peninsula and the Pribilofs as well. Looking at our high temperatures Friday afternoon, getting near 40 degrees for the southern locations of the Panhandle, and then staying in the 20s as we get to northern locations, with Haines only getting up to 28 degrees. For coastal locations of south central Alaska, into the mid-20s, and then in the teens for more interior locations, and staying below zero in the Copper River Basin. Kodiak, however, going to get up to 40 degrees for Friday afternoon. In the interior, many locations are around 0 degrees, staying colder as we move to areas further to the east, and a little bit warmer as we move to the west, with Ambler getting up to 13 degrees. Along the Arctic coastline, well below zero, most places are going to see the minus teens, warmer to the west, and then in the 20s as we go along much of the west coast and St. Lawrence Island. Southwest Alaska near 30 as we get to the coastline, and in the 20s for more interior locations. Down in the Aleutian Islands into the mid to upper 30s, with 36 for St. Paul. Saturday morning lows for the Panhandle area in the 30s in southern locations, 20s farther to the north. Single digits for much of the interior of south central Alaska, and near 20 for the areas along the North Gulf Coast. In the interior portion of the state, all locations dropping down well below zero, and then in the minus 20s along the Arctic coastline, single digits for much of the west coast, then in the teens for much of southwest Alaska, and 30s for the Aleutian Islands and Pribilof Islands. Saturday afternoon highs in the Panhandle area into the lower 40s for southern locations, staying near 30 in northern locations. In the teens for much of south central Alaska, near 30 for areas along the North Gulf Coast. In the interior, we're going to see temperatures staying well below zero and negative teens for much of the eastern and northern locations of the interior, and then well below zero also along the Arctic coastline, in the teens along much of the west coast. Southwest Alaska staying 20 near the water, into the single digits as we move interior, and then in the mid to upper 30s for much of the Aleutian Islands and Pribilofs.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Friday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, we do see quite a bit of IFR conditions, with the main low pressure system out by the western Aleutians, as well as the front pushing through the eastern portions of the Bering Sea and starting to make its way into southwest Alaska. Out over mainland Alaska, primarily seeing VFR, however there are some areas of MVFR along the west coast, as well as some isolated areas of IFR along the northwestern coastline, and then again in eastern and central portions of the interior. Down in the Gulf of Alaska, we're seeing some MVFR conditions and more IFR as we get farther to the east, where we'll see that IFR extending into central and southern portions of the Panhandle. On Friday afternoon, IFR conditions widespread throughout the Panhandle area, with MVFR conditions primarily throughout the Gulf of Alaska and down by Kodiak Island. South Central Alaska should remain primarily VFR, as well as much of the interior, with some isolated areas of MVFR in the interior and along the Arctic coastline. Down the west coast of this state, going to see VFR conditions dropping down as we get closer towards the YK Delta area in Bristol Bay, where we'll see some areas of IFR as well. Central and eastern portions of the Bering and Aleutians will see primarily MVFR, and then IFR conditions out by the western Aleutian Islands. For Saturday morning, we're going to see quite a bit of IFR conditions extending into the Bering Sea, primarily MVFR conditions for the Aleutian Islands, and more IFRs to get closer towards the southwest coastline. Much of mainland Alaska, however, should be VFR, with some isolated areas of MVFR, especially as we get up by the North Slope area and in the Yukon Flats area, where we'll see some isolated IFR as well. Down in the Panhandle area, you're going to see primarily MVFR conditions and some IFR out over the Gulf of Alaska. On Saturday afternoon, primarily MVFR all along the North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island, and down into places of the Panhandle where we'll see some IFR as we get farther to the north. Much of mainland Alaska should be VFR till we get up along the North Slope area, where we'll see MVFR conditions, and then down in the southwestern portions of the state where we'll see some more MVFR conditions. MVFR will be widespread out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, with some isolated areas of IFR. For the passes, and AKwx should be VFR throughout the day on Friday, as well as at Adigan Pass. Dropping down to the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill should both be VFR throughout the day Friday, as well as Rainy Pass and Windy Pass. Isabel Pass should be VFR on Friday, however Mentasta Pass should be marginal conditions all day Friday. Tanita expected to be VFR, as well as at Portage, and then Chilkoot and White will both start off VFR, dropping all the way down to IFR in the afternoon. For our freezing level, we have our surface freezing line moving through the northern portions of the Bering Sea, down through the Bristol Bay area along the North Gulf Coast into the Panhandle area. Some warmer air pushing into southern portions of the Panhandle, freezing levels as high as 2,000 feet in the southern portions of the Panhandle, and some other areas around 2,000 feet just to the south of the Alaska Peninsula. For our icing, with the front moving in, we do have some icing below 10,000 feet by St. Lawrence Island, extending down the southwest coastline through the Alaska Peninsula, about above 2,000 feet there, above 3,000 feet for much of the rest of the Aleutian Islands. Another area of icing out by southeastern Alaska, and that's going to have icing areas above 3,000 feet expected. For our winds starting at the jet stream level, strongest portion of the jet moving through the Panhandle area, out 110 knots out of a southerly direction, picking up as it moves out over Canada. Over the west coast of the state, we are going to see southerly winds up to as high as 80 knots, and then over the northwestern portions of the state, switching to become northwesterly winds around 75 knots, moving around high pressure. Down to 9,000 feet, strongest winds are going to be with our low out by the western Aleutian Islands, where we will see winds over the islands out of a westerly direction around 45 knots. Stronger winds will be to the south of the area up to as high as 75 knots. Out over the west coast of the state, we are going to see winds up to as high as 55 knots near Nunavik Island area, but down by the Alaska Peninsula, dropping down to around 40 knots out of a southerly direction. Out over the Cook Inlet area, we'll see winds to as high as 25 knots out of a southeasterly direction, and then near the Panhandle area, 25 to 30 knots out of a south to easterly direction. Out over the eastern portions of the Brooks Range, northwest winds 25 knots expected. Down to 3,000 feet, once again, our strongest winds will be out by the low by the western Aleutian Islands. We'll see winds to as high as 65 knots just to the south of the Aleutians out of a westerly direction. 45 knots out of a southwesterly direction for the eastern Aleutians, and then southerly winds 40 knots over the Alaska Peninsula, picking up to 60 knots over the YK Delta coastline. As we move in over the interior portions of the state, easterly winds 40 knots for the interior, and similarly up along the Arctic coastline, easterly winds 40 knots expected. Down in the Panhandle area, we'll have winds up to as high as 50 knots out of an easterly direction, just to the west of the Sitka area, and weaker winds through the inside waters. For turbulence all along the Aleutian Islands and western portion of the state, below 3,000 feet up by St. Lawrence, below 5,000 feet by the Agpin, and below 4,000 feet with severe by the central.
Hey there, my starry-eyed friends. Happy Perihelion Day. Perihelion is the point in our slightly oblong orbit when Earth is closest to the Sun. In 2021, it will fall on January the 2nd. Y'all might be wondering why, if we're closer to the Sun, it's full-on winter time. That's because seasons are driven by the tilt of the Earth and not the distance from our star. In the winter, the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the Sun and receives less direct sunlight, cooling us down. Anyway, celebrate perihelion with some African peri-peri sauce and enjoy being 3% closer to the Sun. Or if you're more of a night owl, pop outside and look for Boötes the herdsman in the northeast, because the Quadrantid's meteor shower will peak over the weekend too. 2021, pulling out all the stops. Thanks for watching, Stargazers friends. I'm Trace Dominguez. Keep looking up.
We're at Vandenberg Air Force Base for about 20 minutes before the launch of ICESat-2. You might see the white light off in the distance. That's the Delta II rocket.
It kind of feels like an idea that was always going to just stay an idea. But no, it's real. It's sitting on top of the rocket.
You know, and for me, it's kind of surreal. Like you say, it's been 10 years, and it's hard to believe. It's like, we're really here? This is really about to happen? It's totally cool.
This is Dr. Tom Newman. Over the years, his work has taken him to some pretty remote areas to study changes in the ice regions of our planet. And his research, among many others, has defined the goals of the new NASA satellite, the Ice, Cloud, and Land Elevation Satellite 2, or ICESat-2.
And we have ignition.
The story of ICESat-2 really begins with ICESat-1. ICESat told us all kinds of cool things about the ice sheet and about sea ice that we didn't really know to ask. That data allowed us to measure elevation change of ice sheets in a way that we hadn't been able to before, and showed that all the action on the ice sheets, the places that were really changing quickly, were around the edges. So when we were thinking about what could we do better next time, we knew that was one key component.
In addition to the edges of the ice sheets, ICESat-2 needed to measure a dimension of sea ice that remained elusive: its thickness. To figure out how thick sea ice is, you can measure the height of ice sticking out of the ocean, or freeboard, and compare it to the height of water between the sea ice flows, called leads.
The problem is, sea ice is really dynamic, and those cracks open and close various places in the ice pack throughout the day, throughout the year, and what we need to do is have measurements of the ocean whenever it's available, wherever it occurs in the sea ice pack.
To solve that problem, ICESat-2 was designed with a fast-pulsing laser instrument to take precise, near-continuous measurements across its 3 pairs of beams. For 10 years, everything about the mission was designed to measure rapid changes in the most rapidly changing part of the cryosphere. But it has to get into space first.
But it's a huge transition going from the ground to in space. We've spent better part of 10 years, thousands of people have been involved, and actually seeing the rocket there on the pad with all of that work kind of all put together in one place, it's pretty amazing. And then getting up in the middle of the night to go watch the actual launch, it's sort of surreal in a way, because you've put so much time into it for so long, and actually seeing it over there is like, whoa, you know, it's a big deal.
4, 3, 2, 1.
0.
Lift off.
Push 1.
That was awesome. Totally cool. There it went. That was Atlas. Last Delta 2, heading on out. So Atlas has been turned on over the course of the first few weeks of the mission, really culminating for us with the laser. So this is our first look at sea ice data from ICET-2, and it looks fantastic. The signal levels look great. We've got plenty of photons there. We're capturing ridges. We can clearly see the ocean. All sorts of cool stuff in there, and this is just our first data. It's only going to get better from here on out.
The data from ICET-2 is well on its way into digging deeper into the unknown dimensions of sea ice sheets, and glaciers. It will shed light on changes in sea level and global weather patterns, and once again find new things about ice we didn't know to ask.
So my heart is definitely racing. I don't know about anyone else's. This is the stuff nerds dream of.
Slight chance the flight may see ICET-2 in their center windscreen. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6,
That's gonna
5,
happen.
4, 3, 2.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. We still have deteriorating ice around much of the west coast, especially in the Bristol Bay area with some of that southerly flow coming up. And as that next front approaches the area with more southerly warm winds, we are expecting some more deterioration, and especially in those more southern locations. As we look down in southeast Alaska for Friday in the inside waters, north to northeast wind, 25 to 30 knots with gusts up to as high as 45 knots, especially stronger as we move further to the north. Down in the southern areas, southeast winds 25 knots. Out over the Gulf waters in the east, we have southeast to south winds 25 knots, seas up to as high as 20 feet. As we get further to the north, we're going to see winds northwest of Sitka up to as high as 35 knots out of the east, and 20 to 25 knots out of the east in northern locations. Then on Saturday, in the eastern portions of the Gulf, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots, seas now up to as high as 24 feet, and then dropping down to be easterly 15 to 20 knots as we move further to the north. Inside waters, southeast winds 15 to 25 knots in southern locations, and then becoming north 25 knots up by Lynn Canal. Or south central Alaska, east to northeast winds 20 knots throughout much of the Gulf waters, with some areas near Prince William Sound gusting up to as high as 40 knots. In Prince William Sound, northerly winds 15 knots expected. Cook Inlet, north winds 15 to 25 knots, stronger as we move further to the south. And then west of the Barren Islands, northeast winds 30 knots. As we move into Saturday, Cook Inlet area, north to northeast winds 15 to 30 knots, again stronger in areas farther to the south, and then west of the Barren Islands, northerly winds 30 knots. Out over the Gulf waters, east to northeast winds 30 knots in western locations, 15 to 20 knots further to the north, and in Prince William Sound, northerly winds 15 knots expected. For Friday, around Kodiak Island, northeast winds 25 knots. For the Alaska Peninsula and the Bristol Bay area, easterly winds 40 knots, becoming southerly 20 knots closer to Cold Bay. On the Pacific side, southerly winds 20 to 30 knots. Then on Saturday, around Kodiak Island, north to west winds 30 to 35 knots, as strong as through Shelikof Strait. For Bristol Bay, northeast winds 15 knots expected, southerly winds 20 knots north of Cold Bay, and then west to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots on the Pacific side of the peninsula. Our strongest winds are going to be out by the Aleutian Islands. However, on Friday they will be diminished somewhat from what we were seeing on Thursday. Still going to see some storm force winds out by the western Aleutians, 50 to 55 knots out of a west to southwest direction. Seas up to as high as 48 feet. For the central Aleutian, southwest winds 45 knots, and then seas up to as high as 41 feet on the Pacific side. Then finally for the eastern Aleutians, 25 to 35 knots, weaker as we move further to the east out of a southwest direction. On Saturday, things coming down a little bit more for the western Aleutians, 40 to 45 knots out of a westerly direction. Seas up to a size 34 feet out there. For the central Aleutians, southwest winds 40 knots, seas up to a size 38 feet on the Pacific side. For the western Aleutians, 25 to 35 knots out of a southwesterly direction. Along the west coast, primarily easterly winds, 30 knots for Norton Sound, 45 knots down the west coast, 45 knots out of an easterly direction for St. Matthew Island with seas up to a size 27 feet, and for the Pribilof Island, southerly winds, 25 knots expected. Then on Saturday, still being primarily easterly winds along the west coast, 20 knots in Norton Sound, 30 knots by St. Lawrence Island, 15 to 20 knots by Nunavik Island, easterly winds 35 knots for St. Matthew Island, and southeasterly winds 25 knots for the Pribilofs. Along the Arctic coastline, east to northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, getting up to a size 35 knots as we move down the northwest coastline. Closer towards Kotzebue Sound, 25 knots out of the east, and south of the Strait, 40 knots out of the east. For Saturday, up along the Arctic coast, east to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, getting up to as high as 40 knots as we get closer towards Cape Lisburne, and then 30 to 35 knots out of a north to northeast easterly direction around the Bering Strait. For a recap of our weather for tonight, we have that very strong, very deep low, 927 millibars by the western Aleutians, bringing strong winds and snow to much of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, diminishing a little bit as we get closer towards the west coast. However, we are going to see some blowing snow conditions for the Yukon Delta, as well as St. Lawrence Island and the northwest coastline. We are going to see some fog up along the Arctic coast. Much of the rest of mainland Alaska should be pretty dry until we get down to Kodiak Island and for the Kenai Peninsula. Down in the Panhandle area, we're going to start to see precipitation come back in this evening. That's going to result in some snow along the coastal ranges in areas further to the north, but some rain in areas further to the south. As we move into Friday, continued precipitation for southeast, much of mainland remaining fairly dry, still blowing snow conditions along the northwest coastline, St. Lawrence Island, and the Yukon Delta. Our low out over the Bering Sea finally starting to diminish down to 936 millibars, but still some strong winds throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, as well as some snow at those same locations extending into southwest Alaska.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.